it simply would not enter your mind that that was a conceivable international policy at the present time. Likewise, Al-Farabi does not even consider as more than an odd characteristic of the Greeks not worth mentioning their conception of self-government. I think it will pay us to consider for a moment the origin of civilized society. As I say, I use civilization in the current Spenglerian sense, in which you can speak of a number of civilizations having flourished on the surface of this earth. Before Spengler, of course, the word was not one that you could use in the plural. Civilization meant Western culture, the culture that has been sabotaged, obscured, and all but obliterated. That was civilization. Everything else was barbarism. But given the Spenglerian doctrine, we now speak of civilizations, considerable number, 6 or 7 for practical purposes in Spengler. Toynbee tries to run the score up to 30. And to a certain extent, there is validity in this conception. I'm only sorry that we had to use the word civilization to describe it. There are these parallel developments of societies. I wish that Spengler had thought of some other term, because I think that the 18th and 19th century's distinction, the distinction that has been fundamental in Western thought since the Renaissance, that on the one hand you have Western culture, which is a unique creation. On the other hand, you have barbarisms, which may be magnificent, which may be impressive, but which do not really have the same standard of values or a comparable standard of values to our own. However that may be, let us consider the origin of society. We are so often assured that we live in a changing world, and we're so pleased by the progress of our technology that we sometimes imagine the change, or at least the rapidity of it, is a peculiarity of our time, an originality of which we are as proud as an adolescent who has just discovered that he is in love. Now, the most drastic and rapid social change that mankind ever experienced took place approximately 5,000 years ago in Egypt. I say approximately 5,000 years ago. As you know, the chronology of early Egyptian history has been shortened in the past 40 years by the revisions that successive scholars have introduced. The longer chronology of Flinders Petrie is, I believe, almost discarded by most men in the field. Consequently, approximately 3,000 years ago. To be more 3,000 years BC, 5,000 years ago. To be more precise, it would be necessary to go into a very long discussion. I'm also going to ignore the question of what was happening in Sumeria more or less contemporaneously. Recent scholars are tending to update events in Sumeria even more than in Egypt. And I also dodge the question of why this happened. Every once in a while, an Egyptologist will produce a book to argue that what happened was that Egypt was invaded by a small group of warriors from the north. For that he can make a plausible case, but he cannot prove it. Most Egyptologists regard the developments as entirely indigenous. For that they can make a very good case, although it is a negative one. They argue that it must be indigenous because there are no positive evidences of foreign invasion. Whatever the cause, the change was sudden. A great Egyptologist, Professor John A. Wilson, has compared it to the speed with which a supersaturated solution crystallizes in a flask. And it was drastic. Within a century, the Egyptians were hustled from barbarism to civilization. At the beginning of that period, they were roughly comparable to our Indians of the Southwest. the Indians in their adobe villages before the coming of the white man, a timeless people without a past to remember or a future to plan, a people for whom tribal mores took the place of formal government or social organization, a people that could live almost entirely by instinct, since the monotonous collection of food was varied only by an occasional raid on a neighboring village for exercise. At the end of the century, however, Egypt was a nation that extended from the first cataract to the Mediterranean and subject to the absolute rule of a completely centralized and socialist government. The force that produced this change must have been a force exerted on a number of people, a very large number of people, who probably were not reluctant when the change overtook them because they had not accustomed themselves to thinking in terms of a future, but who must sooner or later have begun to look back on that beautiful era when they were like the Indians in their adobe villages and could live almost entirely by instinct and had nothing to look forward to. There is no real historical evidence, but just human probability makes it certain that in Egypt at this time, what we call civilization was a veneer as thin as the veneer that is civilization for us. Perhaps the most fundamental fact that we forget, and forget to our tragic undoing, is that civilization is a thin crust that is hardened over yet molten lava. It is probable that at any part of the world, a large number, quite probably a majority of the inhabitants, do not really think about the culture that is theirs. Every night, the subways of our great cities carry homeward thousands and thousands of people who understand no more of our society than does a leopard in his cage at the zoo. They follow a routine. They have a job. They have, I hope, some little sense of moral values. Although if you watch them piling on the subway in New York City, you wouldn't believe it. But as for any comprehension of a conscious purpose in Western civilization or in the United States of America or in New York City, they simply do not have it. Well, in Egypt, then, with all of this latent resentment in the mass that had been civilized, there was, for the first time in man's long existence on this planet, a nation. And that nation's resources were consciously marshaled and used by a government which necessarily planned for the future. Writing and written records appeared suddenly to make possible the bureaucracy that managed the nation. And the intelligent direction of human efforts soon required or induced technical accomplishment. At the end of the second dynasty, there was nowhere on the surface of the earth a permanent structure. Nothing had ever been built of stone. Within 100 years from the end of the second dynasty, Egypt had erected the most enduring structure that man has ever built. What was, until quite recently, both the tallest and the most massive building in the world. It was also one of the most accurately constructed. The 2.5 million blocks of stone in the Great Pyramid were faced with blocks, many of them weighing 16 tons, which were finished to a tolerance of plus or minus 1/100th of an inch. Now, when civilization had come to Egypt, it must have seemed eternal. It was, of course, designed like the pyramids for all time. For reasons made clear by Karl A. Wittvogel in his excellent book, Oriental Despotism, published at New Haven in 1957, the earliest and most primitive form of civilized society is always socialism. That is to say, an omnipotent central government with a completely managed economy and with the inhabitants reduced to the kind of serfdom that our planners in Washington are now imposing step by step on the American people. The Egyptian definition of the good state was one in which, quote, well-directed are men, the cattle of God. Men were simply the cattle of Pharaoh, who had all the power that Jack Kennedy craves, and who was by definition the son of God, and therefore God himself. He owned every acre of ground, every house, every stick of wood in Egypt from the first cataract to the Mediterranean, and he naturally owned all the livestock on that plantation, both quadruped and biped. A total socialism, such as Egypt had from the beginning, necessarily excludes all thought of change. That fact, I think, very largely explains its appeal to men. The many hundreds of utopias that have been imagined by idle dreamers, from Yombulus to Sir Thomas More to Edward Bellamy, differ greatly in their details, but they have one thing in common. They imagine a state in which no governmental or social change is possible or even conceivable. And the sincere socialists of our own time, although of course they're vociferous in praise of the inevitable change leading to socialism, promise us the joys of a social order that can never again change and will be immutable forever and forever in saecula saeculorum, or at the very least till the sun grows cold and the stars are old. Necessarily, therefore, the basic assumption of Egyptian civilization was that it was a social order as eternal as the granite of its monuments. But 400 years after Cheops built his pyramid, that order suddenly disintegrated into anarchy and utter chaos. The one thing that we know with certainty about the causes of the collapse is that they were internal. Egypt was not invaded by a foreign people and was not involved in a major war or even any military action other than the routine policing of the few points at which she was not isolated from the rest of the world by natural barriers. There appears to have been a steady trickle of immigration across the Isthmus of Suez into Egypt, but there is no reason to suppose that the immigrants were sufficiently numerous and active either to affect the character of the Egyptian population or to attempt an insurrection. If you look for eternal causes, you note, of course, that the last king before the collapse, Pepe II, ruled for 90 years, which suggests that if he did not begin his reign as God in diapers, he must have ended it as God in a state of senile imbecility, thus possibly inspiring one of his sons or grandsons or great-grandsons with impatience to start enjoying the blessings of divinity himself. But that's a mere guess. No one really knows what the spark was that set off the explosion. Could have been a civil war for possession of the throne. But whatever the source of the spark, it is clear that the explosive materials lay deep in the structure of the society they destroyed. Since a small body of writing, especially the lamentations of Ipuwer and Neferrohu, who witnessed the collapse, has survived, modern historians can learn a good deal about the causes. You'll find them discussed at length in any good history of ancient Egypt. What happened in Egypt was not a mere political upheaval to change the ruler or form of government. It was the ruin of a whole civilization through the collapse of its moral foundations. Ipuwer tells us